This is Freedom First, and I'm Jeffrey Tucker. Today, I want to talk about money, specifically the form of money and its production. This is going to require a little bit of an explanation, so I hope you can be patient with me. When I was an undergraduate, I ran into a small tract written in 1963 by Murray Rothbard. It was called "What Has Government Done to Our Money?" And it told the history of inflation and how governments have messed up our money and stolen our purchasing power from us, which we know about in our times. I mean, my goodness, you know, every time you go to the store now, there's sticker shock. We've lost probably 20, 25, even 30% of the value of the dollar over the last 4 years. Inflation has been terrible, and this monograph, written so long ago, was a very good descriptor of explanation of how this happens through the expansion of the money supply from government, the Federal Reserve or central banks in this case. But what struck me the most was a passing comment that he had in there that, I'm 20 years old at the time, where he said there's no reason why money cannot be produced entirely privately through free enterprise with no involvement from government at all. We don't need government to make our money for us at all. It can be entirely a private sector good. Maybe that sounds obvious to you. At least for me, it was a shock, and I couldn't believe it. I was just stunned to imagine this, but the more I looked into it, and I was a voracious reader at the time, still am, but even at 20, and I realized there's a very large literature on this. It turns out money did not originate by governments just printing it up or minting coins and saying, this is your money, here's the king's picture on it. That's not where money comes from. Money is a naturally involved institution out of the marketplace itself. What happens is people start trading, usually with barter, but barter becomes inconvenient. And over time, the most reliably marketable good that can be easily divided up into incremental units and still maintain a consistent quality and a stable value over time, that becomes the most marketable good, which is to say a good you acquire not to consume it, but in anticipation that you can find others who will accept it. And you can know this in advance. You can anticipate this. You know this for sure. Or you reasonably expect that if you acquire this one good, you could trade it for other goods later. So it could be shells, it could be salt, there's many things in history that have functioned as money. Or in prisons, there used to be cigarettes, now it tends to be cans of fish. Whatever the most marketable good is, that becomes the money. I'll just give you an example that I've observed watching kids on Halloween night come back to the house of origin and trade their candy with each other. There's always one candy that emerges as a kind of a temporary money. In the course of trading, people get tired of trading just the Butterfinger for the Snickers or the Jolly Ranchers for the bubble gum, and eventually one smart kid realizes that everybody wants the Snickers, for example, and even if he doesn't like Snickers, he buys up all the Snickers, and that way that gives him some buying power over the others because he has the good that everybody wants, and Snickers becomes temporarily the money of the realm, even among kids that are 8, 9, 10 years old, okay? So that's where money comes from. It's an emergent property. So it's a question, like in a modern economy, could you actually have a private money? I mean, theoretically, you could, but we've rarely, if ever, seen it before because governments have long monopolized money. Now, why does government love to be the sole creator, production agent of our money? The reason is that it wants to be able to inflate the currency, right? So kings clipping coins, whatever. It wants to have a good relationship with big industries like banks and finance, bond dealers. It wants to be able to float debt for itself, and wants to be able to control the major industries within its realm and the people, and collect taxes in that form of money. So if you're a government, it becomes extremely important that you monopolize the currency for yourself in the interest of your power. Not because society needs such a thing. Economies naturally generate money on their own. That's always been true. But because you want that monopoly on power to be secure. In order to secure that, you need a monopoly on the money. And this has been going on for all recorded history. Now, there have been some exceptions in history, even in the industrialized era, and I want to draw your attention now to a really important book that just doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's by the economist named George Selgin. It was written about 15 years ago. It's called Good Money, and it's a history of private coinage in Britain at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. This is a lot of original research that's in here, but I'm just going to kind of tell you what he came up with. So at the time, let's just say we're talking about 1700. So Britain was, had an imperial army, large industries. They were growing with their empire all over the world, including in the Americas, obviously, and shipping tea all over the world and doing big business. The Royal Mint of the British government was minting mainly large denomination coins in gold. That's what they did. They had a monopoly on gold. They did large denominations. But over the course of the 18th century in Britain, we saw the advance of the Industrial Revolution with lots of small factories popping up all over the realm. And each of these factories needed small denomination coins to pay their workers. Well, they pleaded with the Royal Mint to make those available, and not just gold, but in silver, in copper, and other precious metals, so that they could pay their workers. But it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution where the common people were just now obtaining the rights to own money, which was great because it's not like feudalism where you just trade your work for vegetables or meat or whatever in exchange for which you get security to live on the land. Now you could work and get money and choose to spend that money at the marketplace or on travel or even on buying a home, upgrading your life. This is a big part of what the Industrial Revolution was about. It's about the common people getting power over their lives, but in order to do that, they had to have money. The small denominations that were essential for paying them day to day, week to week, were simply not being made available by the Royal Mint. So, how did the market respond? And this is what the book is about. It's about the rise of a gigantic, eventually very large industry of private coinage in the United Kingdom throughout that entire 18th century period. Over the course of 100 years, button makers converted their factories to become coin makers. And the coins they made were mostly not of gold, although there was a lot of small denomination gold coins, but mostly of silver and of copper, and they were very, very beautiful. And these coins were produced by independent coin makers who would go out and acquire the natural materials, produce the coins in previous button factories or whatever they were, and sell them to merchants who would use them to pay their workers. It's brilliant, right? You see how it happened. Amazing. This is basically an unknown history until George Selgin revealed it in great detail. In the book, which is not available in Kindle, you have to get it in physical form, and unfortunately it's very expensive, has a tremendous number of color photographs in it that illustrate these beautiful coins from private coins from 18th century UK. Very, very interesting. And the description of this very well-developed industry is quite exciting, at least for a person like me who believes, I want to believe that society can function more or less pretty well without overlords and central banks and kings and big shots telling us what to do and owning all of our money and minting everything. It turns out the markets can produce money just fine. But of course, this historical experience went the way of all the others. In 1812 and 1813, the Royal Mint got panicked about the rise of all these private coin makers and passed a law, lobbied for and got passed a law in Parliament that made the Royal Mint the only source of coinage in the realm. So practically overnight, the entire industry of private coinage in the UK was systematically destroyed. Now, why would government do this? To take a beautiful, productive, fabulous industry like private coinage and just systematically destroy it? The same reason it always happens in history, because government wants a money monopoly. Now, you take that lesson forward in time, we can learn a lot of things. One of the things that government does with the money monopoly is systematically depreciate the currency, like ruins it. When a private company, has a good or service, it tries to improve it. When a government owns it, it makes it worse and worse and worse. So we've seen this in American history. Just a quick telling of the monetary reforms that have taken place in the United States. Of course, the Civil War destroyed all currencies, paper currencies that are all inflated away. The Confederate currency became worthless. Now they're just collectibles. And even the currency in the North, was ruined through inflation because of war. That's always happens. By the 1880s, though, we had a good, solid gold standard, still run by the government, but it was a good gold standard. And a decent currency system with very, very low inflation. In fact, we had deflation. Your money grew in value over time. Over the course of 20 years, from 1880 to 1900, we saw deflation. It wasn't a disaster. It didn't lead to depression. It led to vast economic growth. It was a good system. It had flaws, namely a system called bimetallism. So there was a fixed relationship between gold and silver in those days, which that doesn't work because they obtain different values on the marketplace. So you can't force them to be at a specific trading ratio one to the other. But every system has a flaw. Every government system has a flaw, and that was a flaw. Well, eventually, the flaws in the system led to ever more banking crises, and by 1907 we had a banking crisis that was proposed to be ended by the Federal Reserve, which came along in 1913, which promised that it was going to get rid of banking panics and inflation and business cycles. The almost instant result, not instant, but over the course of, say, 10 years, really less than that, 6 years, very high inflation as a result of the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve was used as a way of funding the Great War, the U.S. intervention in World War I. That led to vast inflation, of course. And then the business cycles began. We had a big recession in 1922, 1923, that ended pretty well because we didn't do anything to stop it, we just let it happen. But then by 1929, we had the stock market crash, and FDR took control of the government in 1933. Among his first actions were to devalue the dollar from being defined as 1/20th an ounce of gold to becoming 1/35th ounce of gold. That was a way of just giving the government more revenue, more leeway, more resources to play with without having to tax people. It was no different from the Middle Ages when kings would clip coins or introduce false weights and measures to reward themselves at the public expense. That's exactly what went on in 1933, along with the confiscation of all private ownership of gold, complete with criminal penalties and jail terms for anybody who kept it for any purpose other than jewelry. Now, a lot of people defied this edict, I'll grant you that. And that's a history for another time, but it was an egregious, even totalitarian action to confiscate everybody's gold and then devalue the currency. That happened in 1933. And then after World War II, we had a very similar monetary reform that happened in 1944. Again, the conversion of dollars to gold in the US was banned completely, and the gold standard became an international gold standard fixed at 1/35 an ounce, which didn't work because it applied to all nations of the world, and every nation has different monetary policy and different fiscal policy. Unsustainable, you know, I mean, like a single currency for the world with one definition relative to gold in all countries. So there was no change in the valuation depending on fiscal policy and monetary policy in the respective countries. That's unsustainable. Well, it lasted longer than many people predicted, but began to fall apart in 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971. Nixon closed the gold window. By 1973, the gold standard in America and the world was over completely and replaced by a fiat monetary system. You begin to see the pattern here, right? When government manages the money, it's always ruining it and wrecking it and inflating it and messing up the system for the public. This is the problem with government management. It was a few years later, Hayek, F.A. Hayek, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote a monograph called The Denationalization of Money. This is after he won the Nobel Prize. He said, you know what? There's only one real solution. We have to fully privatize the production of money. Until we get money completely out of government's hands, we're never going to be able to be in a position to manage it in the public interest. It should be a market-based good. Now, economists at the time said, okay, you're a crazy person. That could never happen. But as we've seen from George Selgin's research, it can happen, and it did happen. Private money hasn't failed, it's just been taken away from us again and again. Every time there's an innovation in money, the government monopolizes it. Well, that's a long way of saying that this is a way to understand the attack on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in our own time. We're seeing this tragically unfold, where the US government and many governments around the world have attacked cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin in particular, and all of its derivatives, by going after the on-ramps and off-ramps, the way you convert dollars to Bitcoin and Bitcoin back to dollars. They've taxed it, they've monopolized the exchanges, they've jailed people for daring to convert one to the other without permission. And nowadays, they're actually jailing people for failing to pay capital gains taxes on their gains from Bitcoin. It's really been a brutal attack. And the founders of major exchanges are now doing years in prison. These are not criminals, I'm sorry to say. They're innovators. And this is all part of monopolizing, reestablishing the government's monopoly over the money system. Now, what is the goal? The goal is a central bank digital currency. So a Bitcoin-like thing, except entirely owned and controlled by government itself. Right? It's no different from the Royal Mint in 1813, or some ancient world despot who grabbed everybody's money and took control of it. Like if you've ever seen the cartoon version of Robin Hood, right? It's the same thing. They want all the coins in the realm to serve the regime and its connected industrial interests rather than the people. The same thing is playing itself out with central bank digital currencies right now. Now, what is the advantage of a central bank digital currency to powerful people? Well, under the so-called CBDC, you can program the money to expire, to only be used for certain things, to connect it to carbon credits and rationing of electricity, or any other good, food, connect it to a social credit system like in China, to enable you to buy some goods and not other goods, it becomes a programmable money that entirely serves the purposes of the regime. This is the ambition. It's the reason for the attack on cryptocurrencies right now and everything associated with them, including stablecoins and everything associated with Bitcoins. The reason these things are coming under attack right now is to remonopolize the currency and introduce the CBDC. Now, we've seen a tremendous amount of pushback on this, but there's no question that this is the next round of monetary reform that's coming. Can we do anything about it? I'm not sure. One good thing is that people actually know about it now. They know what's happening. It's no longer disguised. I'm not sure it was disguised in 1933. Maybe people in 1933 thought FDR was eliminating gold to help bring the economy back. In fact, I asked an AI search engine today, why did this happen in 1933? That spat out, oh, it saved us from the Great Depression. Well, it didn't. It made everything even worse. But I'm asking you to join me in analyzing this with clarity and some historical vision and some economic sophistication and see that this does not need to happen. Cryptocurrency is a great innovation in private currency. And if it had been allowed to flourish, it could have eventually replaced government currency according to Hayek's vision. Tragically, we're repeating history in the worst possible way right now, favoring power over economic efficiency, governments over markets, well-conducted, well-connected industrial interests over genuine innovators in the private sector. Brings a tear to the eye. I'm sorry to see it happening, but that is the plight that we're in right now. I think even today, the words of Hayek still bear repeating. We are never going to get genuinely sound money until we can absolutely separate government from the production of money itself. That's the best path to monetary reform. All we need is an enlightened society to demand it and make it so. This, of course, is always in the interest of putting freedom first. This is Jeffrey Tucker.